Hi, I'm Belynder Walia. I'm a psychotherapist, author, TEDx speaker, and the founder of Serene Lifestyles. Please stay tuned for Voice It Out podcast.
Hi, it's Amrita, and I'm back with a new episode for season 3 of Voice It Out podcast. Today's guest is a very interesting person, and I'm sure you will enjoy hearing from her. Just to tell you a little bit about her, she's a psychotherapist, author, a TEDx speaker, and generally a really nice person. And I've only just met her, and I can still say that. It's Dr. Belynder Walia. Hello, how are you?
Hello, Amrita. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I'm so humbled and I'm really honoured to be here, genuinely. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. It's lovely to have you on. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me. Now, when I looked at your social media, I thought to myself, there's so many interesting kind of gripping topics that you talk about that are about the British Asian community, which, as you know, our podcast is about looking at the British Asian stereotypes that we've grown up with and kind of, you know, the thinking that we have as a result of maybe our parents or other generations that we know of. We obviously are living in our grandparents' generation as well. So it kind of just comes down to us, right? So I wanted to actually ask you, first of all, what made you want to be a psychotherapist?
Actually, I kind of fell into the role of being a psychotherapist. I majored in psychology. I was always interested in psychology, actually. But I went into the role of teaching. And I was working as a special educational needs teacher and then teacher trainer. And slowly but surely, I started honing in back into the psychology of the way children think, learn, their well-being, and I just fell straight back into psychotherapy. I thought, this is such an interesting topic and it's something that I enjoy. And I found very quickly that I really enjoyed helping people, and especially the children. I've really enjoyed it. And it wasn't just their learning, it was their overall well-being that I enjoyed. So I went back into education, studied a little bit further, and quit my job, moved on, became a psychotherapist.
And here you are.
Thank you.
So when you used to work with children, did you find it difficult at all trying to hone in on what kind of issues children have? Because obviously sometimes I feel like as adults, we can't fully understand what a child might be going through at any particular point. We can try and see from their reactions or the way they behave, but ultimately, I feel like it's quite difficult to understand. I'm sure you're going to correct me.
Well, like everyone, every human being, everybody has their unique story, everybody has their unique upbringing, and no two people are the same. Even in a family household, we all know that. And for children, if certain things are not explained to them or they can't process or understand their own emotions and feelings and understand what it is with behaviour, no one's there to explain anything to them. Of course, life becomes even more challenging because they're trying to adapt from home life to school life. And sometimes school life isn't very pleasant because of bullying and things like that, and sometimes vice versa, the home life isn't. So it all depends, and if both are very good, then of course there's some stability there. But if there isn't, or there's actual educational needs that they have, or learning difficulties or other ailments that are triggering them, and they don't understand their own symptoms or triggers or behavior patterns, it's very difficult for them to mold into or fit into a school environment. For most children I was working with back in the day, when I was working in schools, I had a lot of refugee children to work with.
Okay.
And I'm talking about the 90s there, and even the early 2000s. And during that time, there were a lot of refugees, and for them, certain behaviour patterns where everyone's sitting quietly, no one's arguing or fighting, if they were coming from a war-torn place, then of course it wasn't normal. It wasn't normal for them. And I remember this one girl, I'll never forget this. We were all sitting on the carpet and I was just talking about what it's like to be a refugee. It was a refugee week, actually. And one girl, she was describing how, oh, miss, when we were back home, we had to all hide under the tables because there were gunshots. And then I saw my uncle get shot and I saw this. And for everyone else in that environment, it was astonishing. It was so overwhelming and so distressing to hear. But for her, it was normality.
It was normal, yeah. That's really interesting because I'm just wondering how the other children felt, because their normality would be so different.
So different. So I think when we talk about children and what their experiences are and how it's been working with them, I've had such interesting cases. And this is another reason why I became a psychotherapist, because when I look at children like that have been through trauma, but they don't understand it is trauma unless it's pointed out and they're informed that is actually trauma that you experience. And it's not until later in life, as an adult or young adult, that they can process that that's not the norm in certain environments.
It's so funny, that kind of joins in with something that we spoke about previously in I think our first season. We talked about the trauma that sometimes our parents have gone through just from emigrating into to the UK from somewhere they called home. For whatever reason that might be, that could have been to better their life. They thought there were more prospects here, or it could have been that they were genuinely chucked out of their country to have to find home somewhere else. And I was going to ask you, actually, even though you were talking about children's trauma, as adults, you've probably experienced, maybe not in a war kind of scenario, but just generally as in British Asian adults, I'm sure you must have experienced that trauma is coming out when they're older as well, right?
Absolutely.
Any kind of trauma. I'm not just saying that it was the emigration.
Yeah.
But any kind of trauma. I feel like that is really difficult to identify in yourself.
It is. And of course, what we learn, and this is something that I was talking about very recently on social media, and I've spoken about it in my book as well. So let's look at generational trauma. Sometimes our ancestors, and let's just go as far back as our grandparents, not beyond that for the moment. So our grandparents have had trauma, but they've not had it identified as trauma. Now, when we look at their upbringing, the way that they were taught that resilience, most of the time, most Asian parents were always told, we don't discuss it, we move on. And they have a lot of suppressed emotions.
Yeah.
And that then, without them knowing it, gets passed on to our parents. And it might be events, behavioural situations that our parents aren't even aware of. Let's just say, for example, my own grandparents. I know that they had to leave India. I know that they had to live through the trauma of 1947. But then, of course, what's happened is over the years, even though people have had a lovely upbringing, like my mum, she was the youngest in that household. My father was the eldest. Lovely upbringing, everyone's happy, they've moved to England, really excited, but they have brought that transgenerational trauma with them without being consciously aware of it.
Yeah.
And you know how some people say history repeats itself? Well, again, without consciously being aware of it, that transgenerational pattern, I believe, continues. And some sort of history repeats where the trauma surfaces again in some form.
Yeah.
And then that gets passed on to you. And then it's up to you. Now we've got that knowledge and we've got so much, technology and AI and information and social media, everything exposed to us, where we can now start understanding, okay, and identifying that is my parents' and ancestors' trauma that I know I have repeated without being consciously aware of it. Therefore, whatever I had to deal with that was really my mum's issue, my dad's issue, my grandparents' issue,
Absolutely.
I've got to process it, understand how it impacts me, understand my inner child, understand how what inner child work I need to do, and then heal from those wounds and learn a little bit more about my feelings, my emotions, my reactions, and then deal with whatever trauma that has been exposed to me and do that healing work. And the more healing work I do and more I learn about myself, the more self-aware I'm becoming. And the more self-aware I'm becoming, I then can learn to accept the good, the bad, the ugly aspects of whatever my ancestors, my grandparents, my parents have been through.
Yeah.
And I just need to work on me. And once I'm able to accept those elements or situations and understand myself a lot more, then I'm able to heal myself and be kinder to myself. And
so everything that you've explained there, like, I think a lot of us feel it, but sometimes, like I was saying, I think we don't identify as that. We don't realize that's not our emotion. That's an emotion from a parent or a grandparent.
yes.
And you just think it's you. So I was going to ask you how easy it is or how difficult to actually start to identify that in yourself, because I feel like it needs to be a conscious thing. You can't subconsciously just get to this conclusion that, oh my God, this is not me doing it. It's because I've been taught to do that. This is why I'm reacting like this towards this thing. But at the same time, that's difficult to it's difficult to separate, I guess, from who you are and the way you've grown up, maybe in the UK, maybe not in the UK, but from my perspective, I've been in the UK since I was born here. I found it really difficult to separate myself from the trauma that my parents might have felt, because I don't know how much they did, and knowing that that's not my trauma.
Yeah.
So how easy or difficult should it be, or is it, to identify in yourself?
I think it all depends on the individual. It's not easy. Most people can't identify it, but if they can, then it does mean healing those inner wounds, those childhood wounds, going back to actually learning a lot more about yourself. Because this is something I've found within the British Asians. I mean, I was born here. And a lot of my friends that were Indian and Asian and were also brought up here and born here, they had to really adapt to what their parents or relatives wanted their lives to be. And they didn't have that freedom of choice. There was always comparisons, and call this comparisonitis. There was always that comparison. There was the competition. There was that, no, we've come to this country to better your life and, give you an education. So therefore you have to be so in profession. And when you suppress those emotions and desires, then a lot of people become quite sad. And then what you're doing, and this is one way of identifying it, is actually not carrying out your dreams and desires. You're fulfilling those of others. And you're constantly then pleasing everyone else but yourself. And you fall into that trap where you don't want to disappoint anyone, but really the person you're disappointing is yourself.
Self, definitely.
And then what's happening in your brain is, at a subconscious level, you spiral into that sadness, or some people, sadly, depression, because they can't fulfill those desires. They can't fulfill those needs that they have. So if you feel that, I can't do what I want, I'm not actually content or happy, most people know that, okay, I need to work on something and understand myself a lot better. And this is where I talk about self relationship and having a healthy self relationship, because it's so easy to try and please everyone else and build those relationships externally and get validations from everyone else. But really, the only person that really matters at this point is yourself. What do you want? What makes you happy?
Yeah, it feels really simple to say that, but I think so many people that I know struggle to put themselves first in any scenario, especially women.
Yes.
British Asian women are really bad at it. But just going back slightly, I just wanted to ask you that basically you've spoken about how people, you know, in our generation, I've seen it as well, or even a generation after mine, we literally sometimes are fulfilling our parents' dreams. And as you say, they came to this country to better our future. I actually sat in a conversation with some family more than a couple, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And I felt like I didn't have a voice because I was the only one from my generation, and all the older members of the family were talking about how we have silver spoons in our mouths because we are in this country. We didn't have to go through having to move countries, or, you know, just leaving homes, leaving relatives, you know, being split from family. And we are so lucky to be here and be in a country that is like this. And I sort of sat there and I had so many thoughts in my head. And I think the one thought that came out of that when I was thinking about it later on in the day was there's an element of a lack of understanding, for one, because I felt like in that conversation, no one actually understood that even we've gone through a struggle as well. Whatever that struggle might have been, there is still a struggle.
Yes.
And it's almost like the struggle that previous generations have is sometimes thought of as worse than the struggle. But everyone struggles, right? It's not like a meter of struggling.
No.
And I feel like there is a lack of understanding a lot of the time from generation to generation. I'm not just saying that other generations don't understand us, but sometimes we don't understand other generations either because we've not been through that. So do you think that there is a level of understanding that maybe that should be developed so that you can identify these kind of things that are being brought down that maybe aren't on you? Like, you don't want to live someone else's dream, you want to live your own life. Do you think there should be some more understanding, and how do we get to that point?
But again, it depends on individual families and family units. And in this case, if there was a lack of understanding, then it comes down to building that communication to help the elders understand the younger generation. Every generation that I've come across and worked with and spoken to, everyone's had their form of hardship. And that, again, it comes back down to that lack of communication and helping others understand. In this situation, I think it's really important that parent carers actually communicate with the younger generation, see what their challenges are, and not make that comparison, which I spoke about earlier.
Yeah.
Because I also believe that what we're doing, even with social media and everything else, there's that desensitizing, and it's really hard for younger generations to relate and actually reflect on what their parents and grandparents might have endured.
Yeah, absolutely.
And their issues are completely different, and they can't, there could be cyberbullying, there could be, just keeping up with what's been exposed to them, the pressure of not learning or socializing so easily, especially since the COVID outbreak. All those things come into play, and the exposure of what kind of ailments are there, the anxieties, the depression, the not being happy, not being satisfied, not having the motivation, all these things. Now, for the older generation to understand those concepts and they compare it to what challenges they might have had, they can't understand it unless someone talks about it. And this is the thing I found in a lot of British, Asian, Indian families. Communication isn't always great. because I know, even if I reflect back, and I didn't spend a lot of time with my grandparents, but even if I reflect back, and I never met my mother's side of her parents because sadly they passed before I was born. But my father's side, we were told what to do. We weren't questioned. There was no conversation. You were just instructed to do certain things that you had to follow through, and that was it. And then I was born here. My mum and dad were here, and my dad sadly passed away when I was very young. And my mum brought us up. And thankfully, I was in an environment where my mum would communicate. But compared to my friends, a lot of them didn't have those conversations. They were just instructed and demanded and commanded what to do. And they had to follow those rules, and that was it. Whereas I was brought up very differently, I feel. I was so fortunate. I had that communication. And I think that's where a lot of parents don't realize that they have to explain things. They have to give reasons for their actions and their beliefs. And they're always worried because of their own past mistakes or situations or experiences that their children might suffer in that same direction. And that's where the transgenerational patterns fall into place, because you're creating that, you're repeating history, aren't you? But if the communication isn't there, then there's no relationship with the older generation and for the younger generation to understand, because no one's sitting there explaining it. No one's sitting there and helping a person understand.
But so I was going to ask you that basically if our parents or previous generations have gone through a trauma, I'm assuming that it would probably be quite challenging for them to understand someone else's struggles, maybe.
Again, because it's not been dealt with internally and they've not recognized it as a trauma, yes, because they're making that comparison, and they will probably say something like, let's take an example of one case example that I had where a grandparent had been through a world war, and his son had his issues and struggles with business, but the grandfather kept comparing it to what his situation was and said that's not a problem, but for that person, it was a problem.
Yeah.
So it's to be able to identify within yourself that, okay, that was a trauma, that was something I had to deal with, and of course, what might seem trivial or small in comparison, it's still that person that's having to deal with it.
Yeah. Exactly that. So just going back to the self relationship in just joining on to that, that's when it comes in, right? That's when it comes in that if you have a strong relationship with yourself, self-love, which I know that you are really focused on, to have a good relationship with yourself, I think that's when you kind of, from my perspective, in that particular scenario, where you just have to understand in yourself that what is happening, what you are dealing with, is still something important. It doesn't have to be important to anyone else.
Yes.
But it's important to you, right?
Absolutely. That is exactly it. You've got to understand your triggers, your symptoms, the habits you've developed. You've got to understand what you're feeling, your emotions, what you're thinking, your thoughts. Understand them, what those thoughts, feelings, and your reactions are. If you don't understand that much about yourself, then how can you expect anyone else to?
Exactly.
And that's where you have to understand your internal world to then be able to relate and understand your external world.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah,
that's so true. So I feel like I spoke about this in a previous episode as well, that, when someone talks about self-love, sometimes I feel like there's a kind of misunderstanding from some people that self-love means everything you think you're doing is correct. Everything you do is correct. No one can tell me what to do. Everything I do is correct. And I felt myself explaining to who said that to me That's not what self-love is. Self-love to me is holding yourself accountable, but also forgiving yourself, being kind to yourself, understanding what you're feeling at any particular moment in time, and just getting to know yourself, really. Yeah. And also accepting that you change. I think that's something that I struggle with, because you develop in yourself and you can't go through things, or, you know, you might be going through a tough time at work or something like that. And just being kind to yourself and understanding that, hold on, I'm dealing with a lot at the moment. You don't have to fulfill and tick every box of the day that you feel like you need to. That is what self-love is, to just understand yourself. But it takes time, right? It takes time, it takes effort.
It does. And I think understanding ourselves isn't easy, as you mentioned, because when people behave the way that they might towards us, trying to understand why they do that, we tend to question ourselves. Yes. And you see, self-love comes into play, I think, when that criticism comes into play. If somebody treats you bad, then you question your worth, your value, and in response, you then start thinking, okay, what is it about me that's made that person feel the way that they do? And then you start thinking, well, maybe I'm not good enough. They're the things that you've got to change. That inner dialogue has to change. You've got to switch the inner critic to be kinder to yourself. And for me, I think kindness is self-love, being kind to yourself. And as you mentioned earlier, and it reminded me of something, there's a Hawaiian prayer called Ho'oponopono. Okay. And this Hawaiian prayer starts off with, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you, and thank you. I think I got it in the wrong order there.
Okay. Sorry.
So it doesn't matter. But the point is that these 4 lines, I usually say as I love you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you. So if we think about it, this to me means self-love. To give yourself that care and attention and positive inner dialogue, and make sure that you're eating well, exercising, taking care of your entire well-being. Okay, that includes your thoughts, your feelings, and your reactions. Okay, I'm sorry is about, and please forgive me, it's all about those times when you've not been taking care of yourself, those times when you've been unkind to yourself, when you've been that critic, when you've been quite spiteful, where you've said things like, oh, I'm so stupid, I should not have said that, or, you know, I don't feel attractive, you know, what's wrong with me, and all those negative dialogues and thoughts that you might have. Forgive yourself, forgive your past experiences as well that might have not worked in your favor, and, you know, mistakes that you've made. Forgive yourself, learn from them, and just say to yourself, okay, that's something that's happened in the past. I know that I didn't feel good about that, but I've got to be able to forgive myself. And then thank you. Appreciation is self-love, because we talk about having gratitude and gratitude around us and for the things and people around us. But what about you?
So true. So true.
So be appreciative of yourself, your journey, and the people in your life that you know are there for you. Focus on the things that have worked in your favor. Have those positive thoughts in the sense that I am lucky that I can think for myself. I am lucky. If you are in control of your life, of course, be grateful for it. If you can make those changes that you can control, then be grateful for it. Be grateful for every sense of yourself, to be mobile, to be able to see, to be able to have those senses. And that to me is self-love, that gratitude. But I really, and I talk about it quite extensively because can I help?
Of course.
Yeah.
There's the
So in my book, I talk about Ho'oponopono, and how you can use this to actually reframe your mind and rewire it to have those beliefs which are positive, and where you're really becoming quite self-aware and self-accepting. And as I mentioned earlier, when we reflect on the good, the bad, the ugly aspects of ourselves, you need to learn to forgive those moments where you might have been ugly in personality to someone.
Because none of us are perfect, after all.
No. And you should be grateful again for those moments where you've actually had fun and enjoyed your own company. And Dr. Joe Vitale, he actually wrote a book about Ho'oponopono. It's something to look into. But
Okay.
it's also mentioned in my book in Fix Me.
Definitely, let's plug this book. It's called Fix Me.
Yeah.
Did it come out last year?
It came out, oh gosh, yes, last year.
2023?
Yes.
I think it was, I read it was...
Time just goes by so quickly.
Yeah.
So it came out at the end of October 2023. Yes.
Amazing. So yeah, check it out. Let me hold it as well. So basically, this is a book about anxiety,
And taking
right?
control of
And
your
taking
life.
control of your life, as it says here. Manage anxiety and taking control of your life. Check it out. Such a nice blue colour as well. So I wanted to ask you actually about this, about the book. I haven't obviously read it, but just the concept of anxiety, because I was thinking as we were talking about the generational or transgenerational trauma, the anxiety that often comes with that. But sometimes I feel like people have anxiety because they can't identify, this is not my feeling, this is a feeling that I've been taught, kind of thing.
Yes.
And I feel like there is some anxiety attached to that we don't realise. And maybe we don't even know what's causing it, but it can be that, right? I feel like stuff like that, maybe at the back of our minds, is causing that. Like the way you behave, you're taught to behave like that. Some of the behaviour is something you're taught, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, well, anxiety is a part of our DNA, really, isn't it? And of course, anxiety can be taught, but there's being taught how to manage anxiety well, or how to manage anxiety very badly.
I think it varies, doesn't it, from
Yes.
individual to individual?
Absolutely. So it comes down to actually managing that anxiety. If you know the anxiety is present, you've got to practice different tools and techniques that work for you to help you to process and manage that anxiety. Everything works differently for each individual. So what might work for me might not work for you.
Yeah.
And sometimes even the thought of that makes people anxious. But unless you try different techniques and you know, okay, I have, for example, a panic attack coming on or some form of anxiety, you should train your brain to know what process, what practice, what method, what technique, or what tool works for yourself. The more you practice, it becomes an automatic response. And that's where people find it really difficult to understand, because they've been taught a different way. And usually from our parents again, if we see that, for example, if my mum panicked about something or got quite anxious about something, I'm picking up her technique, but it's not working for me.
Yeah.
So,
That's interesting.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't realise that. You've got to keep on practicing and seeing what works for you. So in my book, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I used to suffer from anxiety really badly.
Okay.
Really badly. I had to, within myself, find the root cause of what the anxiety was, where it was stemming from, because everything has a beginning, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And once I discovered what the anxiety was, I was just searching different books, trying to find what can I use to help me. And although there's techniques in a lot of books, I found that I needed to create a book that gave those tools that were easy to use and you can use instantly. So there's a lot of quick fixes in the beginning. Of course, it won't work for everyone. And like I said, if you keep practicing something, it becomes an automatic response.
Yeah.
And then you know, okay, managing my anxiety to me means that I have to do the grounding technique, for example. That's when you've got 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can, taste or smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And it doesn't matter which order you do it in, but it could be anything. You've got to see what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think during COVID, because I found that, especially at the beginning of it, I was very anxious because obviously the world had changed and all the things that came along with the COVID pandemic at the beginning, especially. My technique that I found, which I really should continue and I've stopped, I really need to start again, is mindfulness. And I think that is almost another grounding technique because you're focusing on your breathing, essentially, and trying not to let your mind run away with itself. But it is, you're right, because I feel like I went through a lot of things to try and figure out what suits me. But if for you, obviously you talked about that particular grounding technique, for you, despite you writing all these techniques, wonderful techniques into your book, what works for you when you feel anxious?
I think it will come under the category of mindfulness, because sometimes when I'm anxious, I do need to focus on one thing. It could be something around me, and I just focus my attention on that. Say, for example, if there's a switch in front of me, I will focus on the color of it and, what it looks like, and silly thoughts like the wiring come into my mind. I wonder what color the wires are. So I just distract my brain from that anxiety to ground myself sometimes. But more than anything, the reason why I mentioned the grounding technique, that works for me. It really does. And when I just hone in on what's around me and be present, to be present is so important to distract your mind from anxiety. But anxiety can surface in so many different ways, and it can surface in ailments, it can surface in tension, stress, even chronic pain for some people. So it's something that, again, going back to having that healthy self relationship, when you have that healthy self relationship, this is what I mean about becoming self aware, to know yourself well enough to understand, I get triggered by blah, 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 blah. I have this symptom when this happens to me. I react when and when you understand that about yourself, you're then able to manage things like anxiety and stress and tension and even depression.
Yeah. I was going to ask actually, because as you were talking, I was thinking that an aspect of self-love that maybe people might struggle with or might think is maybe not as important as other parts is setting boundaries. I feel like part of self-love is such an important element of it. And I think as British Asian women, we are so bad at setting boundaries, especially, I feel like, especially in my mum's and my aunt's generations, where they are so used to being that role in the household and being that pacifier and the cook and, like everything to everyone in a way. It makes it really difficult to set the boundary. And I feel like I'm always telling my mum, no, you can't do this. Make it easy for yourself. Make it easy for yourself. You can't always. I get it. But I feel like I'm having to constantly, like my aunts, or just remind them that, hold on, you don't have to do it that way. You can do it this way and it will cause you less stress. No, I want to do it the hard way because that's the proper way. So, like it's kind of one of those things where I think setting boundaries is such an important part of self-love that we sometimes don't touch on. What do you think about that? Because I do feel like boundaries are it's a really difficult thing for British Asian women.
I think for women in general.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the stereotypical role of a woman, she's nurturing, she's expected to be nurturing and caring, she's expected to be empathetic, beauty comes into play as well. She's also, with a caring nature, expected certain roles in the home. And just that's women generally, isn't it? That stereotypical role. And also education shouldn't be priority. Creating a family and the home environment, that nurturing, that caring should be in play. And as a woman, it's difficult to set those boundaries.
Yep.
And change those stereotypical identities that have been in existence for centuries. And this is what a lot of women are still fighting today. So as British, Asian, Indian women, it's all good and well that a lot of people say, okay, I know in Indian families, education is priority. I know that because I've come across that in many case examples. But when she's also educated, has a career, she falls into those typical female stereotypical roles.
Yeah.
And then wanting to break free from that, if she wants a family home and she's seen as the nurturer and the carer, it's very, very difficult to break free from that.
Yeah.
And I think women have to wear so many hats and balance so many things. But I think that's what gives them that superpower, because they can do it. They're capable of it. They know exactly how to manage it. What they choose then to accept and do is up to them. And I think that is changing now. Those boundaries are being put in place. And yes, it is self-care, it is self-love. But if we go back to our parents' generation, I don't think we can change that so much.
It's so instilled, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think women of, say, for example, this generation now, or even younger than us, yes, they are changing that. They're more than capable of balancing that work and life and home and work lifestyle, aren't they?
Yeah, but I think sometimes, especially when I've come across like in the workplace, a strong female, and I really admire the balance that a lot of females have in the workplace, because obviously, like you said, they're balancing a lot of the time their children and their partners and their husband, and their partners and their works, their work projects and everything. I do still feel like there's a little bit of a labeling, I guess, that we do. If you see a strong woman, I don't label it myself, but I've seen it happen where she's labeled as, oh, she's really arrogant, or she's really this, she's really, just because she's set a boundary.
Yeah.
And I think that's something, even though we are, like you say, I think we are getting better, especially in our generation, to set boundaries. I think sometimes we as women think so much about what people think of us and the way people perceive us, that sometimes we're kind of maybe a little scared to set the boundary because of the labeling that comes with it. But I think there are definitely women in our generation who just don't care and do it anyway. And I love that, because it's like we say, every individual's journey is different.
Absolutely.
If you feel like you need to set the boundary, like for example, if you need to leave early because you've got something happening with your kids or something, I find it really refreshing now with someone just it's a routine thing. Just do it. And it kind of sets the tone in a way, I feel like. But I think that's difficult to do in every workplace.
It is. And I think people are becoming very flexible as well with these situations. But again, it comes back down to, are you one of those people that needs that validation? Are you one of those people that worries about judgment? It depends on the individual. If I reflect back on myself, the more I talk to people, I realise that I've been brought up very differently from what might be the typical British, Asian, Indian family. And I feel that had my father been around still, it would have been very different. My upbringing would have been extremely different.
Yeah.
But because it was my mother, she was taking on the role of a father and mother, going to work, actually having that work-life balance, coming home, cooking dinner, making sure homework is done, children are in bed, making sure that, the older siblings are taking us to school. But we could have quite easily become very unruly. We could have, gone into the wrong direction, but she had us focused on education. She had us focused. My brother started business very young. She had us focused because there was a lot of communication there. And she always used to say to us, and I think boundaries were taught to us very young, and I'm just realizing this now. She always used to say to us that this is your limitation. If you choose to accommodate and please others beyond that, that's on you.
Yeah.
But don't go above that limitation, because one, you're going to overwhelm yourself. And it could be that limitation was set for everything, going out, friendship circles, and what we wanted to maybe experiment in, whatever it might have been. And when I say experiment in, I'm talking about if we wanted to drink, she would be like, just know what your limitations are here before you go off to university. Just know what your limitations are when you go out. This is the time you should be in. And if you're not indoors by that time, just know that there's consequences to your actions. There was always an explanation given in everything. And just tell me who you're with. All of these things she was setting boundaries. And I think she had to do that because she was a single parent.
Yeah.
And it does depend on the individual. And I think we were taught that from a very young age. And then sadly, a lot of people aren't taught these skill sets, are they? They're life skill sets. There's something that you've got to understand as you're growing up. That, of course, if people take you for granted, they're going to, because you're allowing it.
Yeah.
If you're worried about other people's judgment of you, then think about what you're judging of yourself. If you're going to cross boundaries and go over your limit in substance use, say, for example, then of course the consequences are something that you're going to have to deal with. There's boundaries in everything, isn't there? And I've just now on this podcast realised that's what my mother was doing. She was setting those healthy boundaries for us. She was saying, don't go over those boundaries, be honest, communicate. The more that you tell me and explain things, the more I'll be able to give you my opinion, and then the decision is yours. If you cross those boundaries, then you're not forming healthy boundaries for yourself.
Yeah. It's so true. Do you think that has helped you set boundaries in your life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know I've had, yes, absolutely, because I think going back to my upbringing, I was a very adventurous teenager. I wanted to be a pilot. I became a skydiver, and I was skydiving, all the time. So there were so many different things that I wanted to do, and I think in that situation, in those cases, I cross certain boundaries, but there were lessons I had to learn from it.
Yeah.
And that's what my mother taught us. And there was also those limitations and boundaries that were taught to us that, okay, don't cross those boundaries because then there's consequences. And it brings me back to my uni days when I was so adamant. I had freedom. I could go anywhere. I had to go with my brothers everywhere, my older brothers, but that was fine. I got to, be quite adventurous and go out with them. That was great. But when I was at university, I wanted to move out, and I moved in with these 5 other British Asian Indian girls. And because I was always given a certain limit of freedom, I didn't feel a need to do the things that they were doing because they suddenly had freedom to do what they wanted to do. And this is in the 90s, okay? So they had the freedom to do what they wanted to do. And there I am. I would let my mother know where I'm going, who I'm going with, and they didn't find it was normal. They would look at me and say, how can you even let your mother know what you're doing or where you're going? back in the day, we weren't allowed to go to clubs. Well, I was allowed to go with my brothers, but they weren't.
Okay.
And for me, I couldn't comprehend their experiences and they couldn't comprehend mine. But that's where I was taught, okay, that's your healthy boundaries. If you decide to come home at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're crossing those boundaries. So I had those boundaries in place. So I always knew I shouldn't go beyond that, whether I'm staying with my mum under her roof or living
you're at uni.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm guessing that later on in life, you also feel that the boundaries that you set for yourself have come from your upbringing, right?
Absolutely. Definitely come from that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a related but non-related question. What do you do to maintain good mental health? Personally.
I do meditate.
Okay.
I find having that time, and meditation doesn't mean sitting in a cross-leg position and chanting mantras or anything. It's just having that moment to myself, not being afraid to be alone, to have and process those thoughts and actually understand what I am thinking. So meditation is really important, I think. And also to maintain that mental health, eating well. Food is really important.
Yeah.
Your diet is so important. And a lot of people don't realize gut health
Absolutely.
can change your mood. And there's certain foods that you can eat that can actually increase your serotonin levels. And once that's released into your body, it's the good feel hormone, isn't it? You feel good about yourself when you eat healthy and your gut is healthy and you're not stressing about what's going on in your tummy. So for me, gut health is really important. And I've changed my diet incredibly, and I'm happier. I've noticed I'm happier as well. And I notice people that change their diet are a lot happier. Even things like, I've never drank in my life.
Okay.
I've never experimented with any substances, and I don't smoke. That's my choice. Because to me, I was always taught, again, something that my mother taught us, that your body is your temple. You should worship your body, not in an arrogant way, but in a healthy way, because that machinery, she said, it's like a walking machine. If you don't maintain it, it's going to break down and you won't be able to do the things that you enjoy. And for me, my enjoyment was skydiving, so I wanted to maintain it, you know. And so you've got to really look after your health, and again, to maintain that mental health, have things in balance emotionally, mentally, physically. You've got to balance all three. Your head brain, your heart brain, and your gut brain have to be aligned as well. And what I mean by that is, again, being able to process and understand your thoughts and be clear about them, have that clarity. Again, your gut health helps with that clarity.
Yes.
Because your input is your output, whether it be verbally or any other way. But, you know. So
I love that.
So you've got to make sure that those things are balanced. And emotionally, I would say I don't take anything personally. And that's one piece of advice I would give to people. Don't take things personally, because you're allowing other people's words, and they might be going through whatever they're going through, to impact you. So you've got to make sure that you're constantly checking in on yourself.
Exactly. That is one of the most important things, checking in on yourself.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move to our final section, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So we have a this or that section, just to end on, hopefully, a high. Okay, are you ready?
Yes.
There's 6 of them, by the way. Insider or outsider?
Outsider. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can explain if you want to. You don't have to explain.
No, I would say outsider.
Okay.
I love my walks.
So do I, especially when the weather's good. I think I know the answer to this already, but meditating or journaling?
Am I allowed to say both?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, both, definitely.
Okay.
Because journaling is brilliant. Another thing that improves and increases dopamine levels. So yes. Can I just add to that?
Yeah, of
Because I
course.
think this is another important piece of advice. You see, when you have a negative thought, for example, where you might say, oh, what if something doesn't work out for me? If you switch it immediately in your mind and say, what if it does work out? And then you journal it and you give yourself reasons why certain things might work out in your favor, and you journal for just 15 seconds, you're changing your prefrontal cortex and rewiring your mind. And the more you practice that, the more you won't have those negative thoughts.
Wow. Top tip. That is a really top tier tip. Thank you. That was really interesting. I think I need to start doing that. Carry a journal with me to note things down. Okay. Heels or trainers?
Trainers.
Comfort over everything. Physical or mental well-being?
I would say mental and physical, but more mental, because if your mental state is sound and you feel comfortable and happy, the physical comes into play anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Or both. They balance each other out. Not easy one, that.
I think I would probably say both.
Yeah, both.
But I think a little bit higher on the mental well-being. Yeah. Summer or winter?
I would say summer.
We've not had much of one, but hopefully the next few days will remind us that we do have summer. Mood tracker or habit tracker?
Ah, that's interesting. Mood, probably.
That's a good one. That was my last question. I just wanted to ask you quickly before we end about your platform, Serene Lifestyles. Obviously, it's a platform to do with well-being, and I think you said before that you are expanding on it.
Yes, I'm excited to say I have my new website up and running.
Yay.
So I'm the founder of Serene Lifestyles, and now we have got other experts on board, and it's a wellbeing hub. So we're facilitators, teachers, trainers. We run workshops, and we're a group of speakers. It's expanding quite extensively. If you want to join, please get in touch. And I'm really excited about it and what it will entail in the future.
It does sound really exciting, so do check it out. So my last thing is just to mention your socials or the website, or how do people kind of follow you, or look at the things that you're doing on Serene Lifestyles, etc.
Well, you can find me on all social media platforms. Apart from Pinterest, I'm not very active, but you can find me there.
She's still there.
Yeah, I'm still there. Best place to find me at the moment is the website, www.serenelifestyles.com, and LinkedIn and Instagram.
Amazing. So obviously we will tag her when this episode comes out as well, so you can find everything through her Instagram, through your Linktree link.
Yes.
Yeah,
you can.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so there
definitely.
You go. Okay, so thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It's been really nice talking to you about some really interesting topics, and hopefully we will look at your Serene Lifestyles expanding soon, hopefully, and and everyone will know you from that as well.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that was yet another interesting episode with another interesting guest. So you can also find us on all socials on Voice It Out Podcast. We have an email if you want to contact us, voiceitoutpodcast@gmail.com. And we don't want to keep it in. We want to voice it out. Bye.